Chapter 4. During the time that Oxley, Sturt and Hume had been tracing out and painfully discovering the watershed of the Murray, a settlement had been formed at King George's Sound in Western Australia, and some slight attempts at exploration made, but of inconsiderable extent. The settlement was entrusted to Major Lockyer, who was succeeded by Captain Barker, destined to meet a violent death at the mouth of the Murray. In 1828, Captain Stirling and the Success visited the coast and made a close examination of the Swan River. He was accompanied by Fraser the botanist, who had now been present at the opening of a great deal of new country. Stirling's report was a favourable one, and the home government determined to form a free colony there. In 1831, we find a communication to the colonial government notifying that the Isabella be dispatched to Hobart Town to bring up a detachment of the 63rd Regiment to relieve those of the 39th at King George's Sound. Also directing the withdrawal from the present settlement of both prisoners and troops. Stirling was then appointed Lieutenant Governor, and to induce immigration and settlement, the colonists were promised land in proportion to the capital they brought into the country, and for every labourer they brought out they received 200 acres of land additional. At first, the prospects of this new colony seemed most hopeful. Exploration was pushed out to the eastward for 100 miles as far as Mount Stirling, and northward for some 60 miles or so, and the country discovered gave every promise of being fitted for both pasture and agriculture. Captain Bannister made a trip in 1831 from Perth, the new settlement, to the old one of King George's Sound, and although he made no important discoveries, he passed through fairly available country nearly the whole of the way. For some reason or other, however, a period of stagnation set in, and little more was done in the way of exploring until Lieutenant Grey took the field in 1837. In this new settlement, so entirely opposed to Port Jackson in situation, no difficulties of any magnitude were experienced in passing the coast range, as had been the great obstacle of the early explorers in New South Wales. Unfortunately, however, the comparatively lower altitude of the Darling Range led to there being no such flow of water inland as even those disappointing rivers the Macquarie and Lachlan had afforded. Consequently, exploration and the ensuing occupation were, as in the parent colony, strictly confined to the immediate neighbourhood of the township, to the Swan River and its tributaries, the Avon and the Canning. Lieutenant Rowe attempted several journeys to the eastward and discovered many salt lakes on the tableland of the interior. Messrs. Bunbury, Wilson and Moore made other explorations, more or less succeeding in the purposes they had in view. But they all embrace so small an area, and so little details have been preserved that they cannot take any important rank in the history of continental explorations. During the 20s, another settlement had been formed on the northern coast of Australia, but one not destined to drag out a very long existence. Captain Gordon Bremer, in the Tamar, accompanied by 2 transports, sailed through Torres Strait and anchored in Port Essington in 1824. The port was, however, at that time condemned as a site for a settlement. The supply of fresh water did not come up to expectations, and the dry months of the year had set in. Bremer sailed for Melville Island, one of twin islands lying off the coast. These islands, Melville and Bathurst, are separated from each other by a narrow strait that Captain King, the discoverer, mistook for a river. On Melville Island, a favourable site with abundance of fresh water was found, and the usual routine of taking possession and forming an encampment gone through, and for a time things seemed to prosper. The soil of the island is good, and tropical fruits would flourish with little trouble. But hostilities commenced with the blacks, sickness broke out, and in 1829 it was determined to abandon the settlement, and since that date no attempt has been made to colonise this island, although it is now stocked with the increase of the buffaloes left behind by the Tamar's people. Fort Wellington in Raffles Bay, founded in 1826, fared no better, although controlled during its last year by the gifted and unfortunate Captain Barker. A blight of stagnation seemed in those days to hang over all attempts at settlement in the tropical regions, and in 3 years' time Fort Wellington was abandoned, and with it the northern coast. Once more we must turn our attention to the southern watershed of the Darling, and the additional links of discovery in the great network of its tributaries. Rumour, always busy with tales of the unknown interior, now spread a story of a mysterious river called the Kinder, running to the northwest. A runaway convict named Clark, alias the Barber, brought the story up first. He said that he had long heard of the river from the natives, and at last determined to make his escape and follow it down to see if it would lead him to any other country. He therefore took to the bush and started on this adventurous trip. The imaginative and highly coloured fabrication that he related on his return was probably invented in order to save his back, but at any rate it was plausible enough to induce the government to dispatch an expedition to investigate the matter. This was his story. He started from Liverpool Plains and followed a river called by the natives the Namoy, in which he said that Oxley's River Peel flowed. Crossing this, he struck another river, the Kinder, and down this stream he travelled no less than 400 miles before it was joined by the Namoy. Nothing daunted, he stuck to the Kinder, which was broad and navigable, flowing through level country and spreading into occasional lakes, until at last he reached the sea. But he acknowledged that he had lost his reckoning, and whether it was 500 or 5,000 miles he went, he could not truthfully say. But he was as quite sure upon the point that he had never travelled south of west. When, at the mouth of the river, he ascended a hill and looked out to sea where he saw an island inhabited, the natives told him, by copper-coloured men who came in large canoes to the mainland for scented wood. In addition, he introduced various details of large plains, Ballyran that he had crossed, and a burning mountain named Currada. As he saw no prospect of getting away from Australia, Clark decided on returning. This wild tale, and the expedition it led to, brings on the scene one of the most noted figures of the past, Oxley's successor, Surveyor-General Major Mitchell. The acting governor, Sir Patrick Lindsay, decided on sending out an expedition to find out the truth of this story, thinking that, at any rate, it would lead to the exploration of a great deal of new country. Accordingly, Major Mitchell received instructions to take charge of the party, and on the 21st of November, 1831, took his departure from Liverpool Plains. On the 15th of December he came to the Peel, and crossing Oxley's Hardwick Range reached the Namoy River on the 16th. After penetrating some distance into a range, which he called the Nundawa Range, he made back for the Namoy, and proceeded to set up the canvas boats he had with him, intending to try to follow the river in them. His attempt was fruitless. One of the boats was soon snagged, and it became evident that it would be much easier to follow the Namoy on horseback. Leaving the river, after passing the range he had vainly tried to cross, Mitchell, on the 9th of January 1832, came to the River Gwydir of Cunningham. Turning to the westward, the party followed this river down for 80 miles, when he again returned to his northern course, and came to the largest river he had yet found. This was called by the natives the Karala, and Mitchell descended it until convinced by its southern course and the junction of the Gwydir that he was on the upper part of Sturt's Darling. As the junction of the Namoy could not be far distant, Mitchell had thus laid down the course and direction of these two large rivers, although he had as yet seen nothing of the object of his search, the Kinder. He now prepared to move once more to the north, anxious to find a river that did not belong to the Darling system. As, however, he was on the point of starting, he was overtaken by his assistant surveyor Finch, who was bringing on additional supplies with the disastrous news that the blacks had attacked his camp during a temporary absence, murdered the 2 men, robbed the supplies, and dispersed the cattle. This misfortune put a stop to the progress of the party. They returned, and having buried the bodies of the victims but failed to find the murderers, made their way back to the settled districts. This journey of Major Mitchell's helped greatly to work out the courses of the rivers crossed by Oxley, and more especially those discovered by Cunningham during his trip to the Darling Downs. Mitchell travelled, as it were, a more inland but parallel track, crossing the rivers much lower down. Thus the field of Oxley is the Namoy of Mitchell, Cunningham's Gwydir is recognised by the Surveyor-General, and is probably the mythical Kinder or Kinder, whilst the last found river, Mitchell's Corolla, is formed by the junction of Cunningham's Dumaresque and Condamine. When we add to this the discovery of the Drummond Range, Mitchell's first contribution to Australian geography was sufficiently important. This year, 1832, was marked by the murder of Captain Barker, already mentioned as in turn Commandant of Fort Wellington and King George's Sound. He was returning from the latter place after handing over charge to Captain Stirling, and on his way home landed on the eastern shore of St. Vincent's Gulf, to see if the waters of Lake Alexandrina, the termination of the Murray, had an outlet in the Gulf. Being unsuccessful, he crossed the range and paid a visit to the lake. Anxious to obtain some bearings, he swam across the channel connecting the lake with the sea in order to ascend the sandhills on the opposite side. His companions watched him take several bearings from the top of the hill, descended out of view on the other side, and he was never seen again. One of the sealers from Kangaroo Island interrogated the blacks by means of a native woman of the island who could speak broken English, and her account was that Barker met 3 natives as he descended the sand dune, who attacked and speared him, unarmed and naked as he was, and then cast his body in the breakers. These natives were of the same tribes that showed such determined hostility to Sturt when he first found the lake. Although Sturt himself felt confident that the junction of the Murray and Darling was satisfactorily proved by what he saw in his famous boat excursion, he had not convinced all of the public. Major Mitchell, for one, had an entirely different theory on the subject, embracing the existence of a dividing range between the Macquarie and Lachlan rivers, which would entirely preclude the Darling and Murray from joining. Time, however, proved that Sturt's instinct had not been at fault when, on reaching the junction of the 2 rivers in his whaleboat, he felt convinced that he there saw the outflow of his old friend, the Darling. It must be remembered that the explorations conducted by Major Mitchell were also surveys, superintended by him as Surveyor-General, which will partly explain the presence of the large body of men and equipage which it was his custom to take with him. The roll call of the members of one of his expeditions reads like that of an invading army. In order to get some additional information concerning the elevated country that Oxley had noticed to the westward between the Lachlan and the Macquarie, on which slight foundation Major Mitchell had built his theory of the 2 rivers running through distinctly different basins, Mr. Dixon was sent out in 1833. This gentleman, however, for some reason did not adhere to his instructions. He followed down the Macquarie for some distance and crossed to the Bogan, Sturt's New Year's Creek. Then, running strong and having followed that river for 67 miles, returned to Bathurst. Nothing new nor important came of this expedition. In March 1833, the party formed under the superintendence of the Surveyor-General left Parramatta to travel by easy stages to Buree, where they were to be overtaken by their leader. The list of the members is a long one. We who live in the days of well-equipped small parties, composed of reliable, experienced men only, would feel considerably handicapped with such a retinue. In addition to Major Mitchell, Richard Cunningham, botanist, brother to Alan Cunningham, and Mr. Lama, assistant surveyor, there were 21 men, carpenters, bullock drivers, blacksmith, shoemaker, etc. While still on the outskirts of settlement, an unhappy fate overtook Cunningham, the botanist. Leaving the party, doubtless on some scientific quest, during the morning of the 17th of April, whilst they were pushing over a dry stage to the Bogan River, he lost his way and was never seen again. A long and painful search was immediately instituted for the missing man, but unfortunately, through some accident, his tracks were overlooked on the third day, and it was not until the 23rd of the month that the footsteps were found. Mr. Lama and 3 men were sent with an ample supply of provisions to follow the tracks until they found Cunningham alive or dead. 3 days later they returned, having found the horse he had ridden dead, with the saddle and bridle still on. Mitchell returned to the search once more, lost the man's trail, was again picked up, and he was tracked to the Bogan River. There they met with some blacks who had seen the white man's tracks in the bed of the river and made the searchers understand that he had gone to the west with the mile, wild blacks who had not visited the settlements. All hope of finding him alive was now almost abandoned, but the pursuit was continued until May 5th, when the men brought back tidings that they had followed his tracks to where it disappeared near some recent fires where many natives had been encamped. Close to one of these fires they found a portion of the skirt or selvage of Cunningham's coat, numerous small fragments of his map of the colony, and in the hollow of a tree some yellow printed paper in which he used to carry the map. His fate was afterwards ascertained from the blacks. As is, unfortunately, so usual in these cases, Cunningham had, by wandering in eccentric and contradictory courses, accelerated his fate, by rendering the work of the tracking party so much more tedious and difficult. Had he, on finding how absolutely he was astray, remained at the first water he reached, he would have been found. Having done all that man could do to find his lost friend, and even jeopardised the final success of his own expedition by the long delay of 14 days, Mitchell resumed his journey by easy stages down the Bogan, and on the 25th of May reached the Darling, which was at once recognised by all the former members of the party as Corolla, from the peculiar attributes that characterised it. On tasting the water, they were agreeably surprised to find it fresh and sweet. The state of the country now was very different from what it was when Sturt was forced to retreat. With that explorer's graphic account of the barren solitude that he met with, fresh in the reader's memory, let him contrast it with what Mitchell writes, remembering that one was encamped beside a salt stream, and the latter writer beside a freshwater river. Quote, "We were extremely fortunate, however, in the place to which the bounteous hand of Providence had led us. Abundance of pasture, indeed such excellent grass as we had not seen in the whole journey, covered the fine forest ground on the bank of the river. There were 4 kinds, but the cattle appeared to relish most a strong species of Orthisteria, or kangaroo grass." End quote. Finding the place eligible in every respect for the formation of a depot, a stockade of logs was erected and the encampment christened Fort Burke. The boats were launched, but the navigation of the river was found to be impeded by shallow rapids, so the party returned to Fort Burke, and Mitchell with 4 men made an excursion down the river to the point where Sturt and Hume turned back. Durbin's group was also visited, and bearings taken to whatever elevations were in sight. On returning to the depot, the camp was broken up and the whole party started down the Darling, the Kallawatta of the natives, on the 8th of June. During their progress they found the tree marked HH by Hume, at Sturt's limit, and they now noticed that in places the river was salt or brackish. On the 11th of July, after following the course of the river for 300 miles and ascertaining beyond all doubt that it must be identical with the junction in the Murray, noticed by Captain Sturt, Mitchell determined to return. The unvarying sameness of the country they had travelled over, holding forth no hope of any important discovery being made in the space intervening between their lowest camp and Sturt's junction. The natives, too, had been an incessant cause of annoyance to them, robbing the camp at every opportunity and keeping the leader in constant anxiety for the safety of any of the members of his party, whom duty compelled to leave the main body. On the very day, almost at the very hour when Mitchell made up his mind to return, the first hostile collision between the two races occurred. A collision which had only been hitherto averted by the admirable patience of the Major and his men. On the 29th June, he wrote, quote, "I never saw such unfavourable specimens of the Aborigines as these children of the smoke," referring to their constant habit of burning the grass. "They were so barbarously and implacably hostile and shamelessly dishonest, and so little influenced by reason, that the more they saw of our superior weapons and means of defence, the more they showed their hatred and tokens of defiance." End quote. On the morning of this day, when he had settled in his own mind the futility of further progress, 2 of the men were away at the river, and 5 of the bullock drivers were also at another bend, collecting their cattle. One of the blacks, whom they had nicknamed King Peter, tried to snatch the kettle of water from the hand of the man who was carrying it, and, on being resisted, he struck him senseless with his nulla. The companion of the wounded man shot King Peter in the groin, and His Majesty tumbled into the river and swam across. The tribe now advanced against them, and 2 shots were fired in self-defence, one of which accidentally wounded a gin. 3 men from the camp, hearing the firing, came up, and 1 more native was shot, who was preparing to spear one of the men. The natives retreating, the men went in search of the bullock drivers, whom they found endeavouring to raise a bogged bullock. Their timely arrival probably saved these men's lives, as they were unarmed and unprepared. War being thus declared, a careful watch was kept up, but no attack was made, and the explorers departed unmolested. In speaking of this skirmish, Mitchell, seemingly worked up to a sentimental pitch by hearing some gins crying out across the river in the night time, says, quote, "It was then that I regretted most bitterly the inconsiderate conduct of some of the men. I was indeed liable to pay dear for geographical discovery, when my honour and character were delivered over to convicts on whom, although I might confide as to courage, I could not always rely for humanity." End quote. By his own account, as given above, the affray was provoked by the blacks, who compelled the men to use their weapons to save their own lives. The reflections, then, on their humanity and the danger in which his character stood in consequence are slightly out of place. The travellers now retraced their steps, and beyond the delays caused by some of the bullocks knocking up, their return journey to Fort Burke was unmarked by anything of interest. From Fort Burke they returned, partly along their outward track, to the head of the Bogan, and reached a newly formed cattle station belonging to Mr. Lee of Bathurst on the 9th of September. The great fact added to the geographical knowledge of Australia by the successful termination of this trip was the identity of the Darling with the Corolla on the north, and with Sturt's Murray Junction on the south. It was now satisfactorily settled that this river was the channel that received all the tributary streams flowing westward, so far north at any rate, as Cunningham's researches had extended, and that therefore their final outlet was in Lake Alexandrina, and the idea of a river winding through the interior to the northwest coast had to be finally relinquished. This journey of Mitchell's was also instrumental in somewhat palliating the view held of the uninhabitable nature of the far interior. Although the true character of the country had yet to be learned and appreciated, his stay on the banks of the Darling at least lifted from those plains the stigma of a grassless, naked waste, intersected by a river of brine. Mitchell, too, was a keen observer of the habits and customs of the blacks. He was remarkably quick at detecting tribal differences and distinctions, and his record of his intercourse with them, which occupies so large a portion of his journals, was interesting then, when so little had been written on the subject, and is interesting now as the account of the white men's first incursions into the hunting ground of a fast vanishing race. Mitchell's next expedition took place in 1836, in the month of March, As before, it was to be more of a connecting survey, confirming and verifying previous discoveries than a fresh departure into an utterly new region. But it turned out to be productive of the most important results. The Surveyor-General was informed that the survey of the Darling was to be completed with the least possible delay, that having returned to the point where his last journey terminated, he was to trace the Darling into the Murray, and, crossing his party over that river by means of his boats, follow it up, and regain the colonies somewhere at Yass Plains. This program was, however, departed from in many ways. The new ground broken by Mitchell would thus be the Murray River above the junction with the Murrumbidgee, as it was now called, and it was supposed that he would be able to identify it with the Hume River of the explorer of that name. A long-continued drought was in full force when Mitchell commenced his preparations. Horses and bullocks in good condition were in consequence hard to obtain, but no expense was spared by the government in providing the animals required. On reaching Bathurst, he was informed that even the Lachlan was dry. In spite of the state of the weather and country, Major Mitchell departed in high spirits. He writes, quote, "I remembered that exactly that morning, 24 years before, I had marched down the glacis of Elvas to the tune of St. Patrick's Day in the morning, as the sun rose over the beleaguered towers of Badajoz. Now, without any of the pride, pomp, and circumstances of glorious war, I was proceeding on a service not very likely to be peaceful. For the natives here assured me that the miles were coming up Murray cooler," very angry, "to meet us." End quote. On March 17th, 1836, this start took place, but it was not until the end of the month that he reached the limit of the cattle stations, and then he was at the point where Oxley had left the river and turned south to avoid the flooded marshes. Oxley wrote of a country that no living thing would stop in if it could possibly get away. 20 years afterwards, Mitchell writes of the same place, quote, "In no district have I seen cattle so numerous as all along the Lachlan, and notwithstanding the very dry season, they are nearly all in good condition." End quote. As might have been expected, he followed down the Lachlan, riding dry-shod over the swamps and flats that had barred Oxley's progress, and finding his lakes only green and grassy plains. Such had been the effect of the exceptional season during which the late Surveyor-General had conducted his explorations that the country, save for the few landmarks afforded by the hills here and there, could scarcely be recognised from his description. Mitchell seems to have been strongly imbued with two leading ideas, one being the existence of well-defined mountain chains in the interior, forming the systematic watersheds in a country where we now know there is no system. The other, that former explorers, however reliable they might have been in their main facts, were quite at sea in any deductions that they had drawn from them, and that his theories would be confirmed to their discomfiture. The Surveyor-General had with him as second on his trip Mr. Stapleton, a surveyor, and his company consisted of Burnett, the overseer, and 22 men, some of whom had been with him before. For some reason or other, he seemed particularly anxious to upset Sturt's positive belief that the junction of the large river with the Murray discovered by him was the confluence of the Darling and the Murray. During his journey down the Lachlan, he returns to this idea again, and his remarks are decidedly inconsistent with his former statements. On turning back from following the Darling down, his words were, quote, "The identity of this river with that which had been seen to enter the Murray now admitted of little doubt, and the continuation of the survey to that point was scarcely an object worth the peril likely to attend it." End quote. On the Lachlan, he writes, quote, "I considered it necessary now to ascertain, if possible, and before the heavy part of our equipment moved further, whether the Lachlan actually joined the Murrumbidgee near the point where Mr. Oxley saw its waters covering the country, or whether it pursued a course so much more to the westward as to have been taken for the Darling by Captain Sturt." Should I succeed in reaching the Lachlan at about 60 miles west of my camp, I might be satisfied that it was this river which Captain Sturt mistook for the Darling, and then I might seek that river by crossing the range on the north. Whereas, should I find sufficient reason to believe that the Darling would join the Murray, I might continue my journey down the Lachlan until I reduce the distance across the Darling as much as the scarcity of water might render necessary." End quote. On the whole, then, Mitchell did not seem inclined to give Sturt any credit for his discovery until he had actually seen the two rivers unite, and there could no longer be any room for doubt on the subject. A long excursion to the westward for some days resulted in nothing but thirsty nights and having finally to turn back from country bounded only by an unbroken horizon. The descent of the Lachlan was continued, and on May 5th they reached Oxley's lowest point on the river, where he had given up the quest as hopeless amid the shallow, stagnant lagoons that then covered the face of the country. The tree marked by Oxley himself was not found, it having been, as was ascertained, burnt down by the blacks, and the bottle buried by him broken by a child. Two trees were seen marked respectively WW and IW 1817. This was the place where Oxley left the river the second time after his fruitless trip to the south, and from here he struck across the Macquarie. Through level plains and by the beds of erstwhile lakes the course of the river continued, and as the party proceeded they found it abundantly watered. From his intercourse with the native inhabitants, Mitchell was now convinced that the Lachlan or Kalari would soon join the Murrumbidgee, so that when on the 12th of May he suddenly found himself on the banks of a river that he thought surpassed all the Australian rivers he had yet seen, he was not surprised. Soon afterwards, as the Major was anxious to not encumber himself with all his heavy wagons to the junction of the Darling, as he would have to return again, a depot was formed, and the men divided. Mitchell, with a lightly equipped party, following down the river, leaving Stapleton in charge of the camp. In a short time the advance party came to the Murray, and immediately found themselves amongst their former enemies of the Darling, who, hearing of their approach through the medium of other tribes, had come a distance of over 200 miles to settle the old score between them. At first a kind of hollow truce was maintained, but this evidently could not last long. For 2 days the natives followed the explorers, seeking to cut off any stragglers, making the work of gathering and minding the cattle and horses one of considerable danger. At last Mitchell was convinced that he must read them a lesson, or lose some of his men and have to fight his way back with the whole country roused. Half the party were then sent back, under the overseer, to conceal themselves in the scrub and allow the natives to pass on in pursuit of the tracks. This ambuscade, however, was scented out by the dogs accompanying the blacks, and the natives halted, poising their spears. One of the men hastily fired, and a retreat was made for the bank of the river by the blacks. The scrub party followed them up, firing, and no sooner did those in advance hear the sound of the shots than they rushed down to join the fray, leaving the black boy's gin the sole protector of the drays and equipment. On his return the Major found her standing erect at the head of the leading horse, with a drawn sword over her shoulder. Her appearance was, above all, both laughable and interesting. She was a tall, gaunt woman, with one disfigured eye, and her attitude as she stood there with the naked weapon in her hand, faithful guard of all their belongings, was a picture that Mitchell did not soon forget. The fight was soon over. In a very short space of time, the overconfident warriors of the interior were driven ignominiously across the river with the loss of 7 braves. This, after invading the territory of a friendly tribe in order to provoke a battle with the whites, and boasting that formerly they had driven them back from the Darling, was a blow that they could not get over, and the result was that the whites were not again molested. It turned out that this pugnacious tribe was the same that threatened Sturt at the Darling Junction, when the energetic interference of one man was so effectual. This remarkable savage, it seems, was dead, and his influence lost. On the 31st of May, Mitchell struck the Darling some distance above the junction, and traced its course upwards a short way until he again felt convinced that it was the same river that he had been on before. He returned and examined the junction, which he says he recognised from the view given in Captain Sturt's work and the adjacent localities described by him. Full of anxiety for the safety of his depot, and considering that he had done enough to verify the outflow of the Darling, he at once started up the Murray, and was happily relieved by finding his camp in perfect quiet and safety. Note, Captain Sturt, writing in 1848 and speaking of Major Mitchell's expedition, says, quote, "In due time he came to the disputed junction, which he tells us he recognised from its resemblance to a drawing of it in my first work. As I have since been on the spot, I am sorry to say that it is not at all like the place, because it obliges me to reject the only praise Sir Thomas Mitchell ever gave me." End quote. The original sketch of the junction having been lost, Sturt, who was nearly blind at the time of the publication of his work, got the assistance of a friend who drew it from his verbal description. First, fixing the junction of the Murray and Murrumbidgee, the boats were launched and the whole of the party crossed the Murray, and the journey up the southern bank commenced. On the 20th of June they reached Swan Hill and camped at the foot of it. The country was in every way desirable, and the progress of the party was unchecked. On the 8th of July the Loddon was discovered and named, and on the 10th the Avoca. Mitchell was now convinced that he had found the Eden of Australia, and his enthusiasm in describing it is unbounded. On the 18th of July he discovered the Wimmera, and on the 31st the Glenelg. Here he launched his boat once more, but found his way stopped at the outset by a fall, and the river had to be followed on land. On the 18th of August, after many excursions, the river being now much broader, the boats were again resorted to, and in 2 days they reached the coast a little to the east of Cape Northumberland. Returning to the camp, the expedition made east and reached Portland Bay, where they found a farm established by the Messrs. Henty, who had been there then nearly 2 years. Here they obtained some small supplies and again left on their homeward journey. On the 4th of September, Mitchell abandoned one of his boats in order to lighten his equipage, as the draft work was excessively heavy for his cattle, and one boat would answer the purpose of crossing rivers. On the 10th he caught sight of a range and named it the Australian Pyrenees, and on the 19th the party separated. The Major and some of the men pushed on with the freshest of the animals, leaving Stapleton and the remainder of the party to spell for a while and bring the knocked-up beasts slowly on. On the 30th, Mitchell ascended Mount Macedon, and from the top recognised Port Phillip. Quote, "No stockyards nor cattle were visible, nor even smoke, although at the highest northern point of the bay I saw a mass of white objects, which might have been either tents or vessels." End quote. But Mitchell was not to arrive home without another fatality amongst his party. On October 13th, when looking for a crossing in a river, one of the men, named James Taylor, was drowned. On the 17th, after passing through a forest, they recognised with great satisfaction the lofty yarra trees and the low verdant alluvial flats of the Murray. Once across the river, the boat was sunk in a deep lagoon and the boat carriage left on the bank for the use of Stapleton. 3 volunteers went back to meet him and assist in crossing the Ovens and Goulburn. The advance party were now almost within the settled districts, and with the safe arrival of Stapleton at the Murrumbidgee on November 11th, the history of the discovery of Australia Felix ends. Sir Thomas Mitchell had been singularly favoured during this journey. His route had led him through a country possessing every variety of feature, from snow-topped mountains to level plains, watered by permanently flowing stream and rivers, fitted, as he says, for the immediate occupation of the grazier and the farmer. It, therefore, was of a more real benefit to the colony than the former exploratory journeys, that had met with only partial success in this respect. He had well carried out his instructions and obtained a full knowledge of the country south of the Murray and of the rivers there, flowing either into that river or into the sea, confirming the impression already entertained of the great value of the district, and the report of Hume and Hovell, who with their slender resources were unable to do much in the way of extended examination. We have seen that the brothers Henty of Tasmania had formed a settlement at Portland Bay, and in 1835 the historic founding of Port Phillip settlement by Batman took place, so that the mere extension of settlement would soon have thrown open for settlement the splendid area that Mitchell was just in time to claim as his discovery. The story of Batman's compact with the blacks, by which he asserted his right to a princely territory, is too well known to require repetition. It is scarcely necessary to add that such a preposterous demand was neither ratified by the government nor recognised by the settlers. Note: the agreement was between Messrs. Batman, Gellibrand, Swanston and Simpson on the one side, and the natives were represented by Jagga Jagga, Coolaluk, Bungaree, Yan Yan, Maustrip and Mamamala. The price was fixed at an annuity of $200 a year in return for 750,000 acres of land. Mr. Gellibrand afterwards perished in the bush with a companion, Mr. Hess, having lost himself through persisting in keeping in the wrong direction, although warned by a guide who left them on finding Gellibrand determined to go wrong. It was through the energy of the Tasmanian colonists that this settlement of Port Phillip took place. As already noticed, Port Phillip was abandoned, almost without the slightest examination, by Colonel Collins in favour of Tasmania. And now, after 30 years had passed, the abundant flocks and herds of the little island forced the owners to look to the mainland for extended pastures. One of the incidents of the early settlement was also the discovery of Buckley, a white man who, having escaped from Collins' party in 1803, had been living with the natives ever since. In 1836, Colonel Light surveyed the shores of St. Vincent's Gulf and selected the site of the present city of Adelaide. Governor Hindmarsh and a company of emigrants soon after arrived, and the colony of South Australia was proclaimed. The continent was now being invaded on three sides: from Perth on the western shore, from St. Vincent's Gulf and Port Phillip on the south, and from the settled districts of New South Wales and from Moreton Bay on the east. Henceforth, the tale of exploration embraces many simultaneous expeditions. No longer is the whole of the narrative confined to the struggle of one man, hopelessly endeavouring to surmount the coast range, or toiling across the western plains, anxiously watched by the little community at Port Jackson. Each new formed centre had their members pushing out, month after month, and continually adding to the knowledge of Australia. As usual, the records of most of these private expeditions have not been preserved, and the utmost the historian can do is to trace out the broad lines of discovery, leading the reader to consider the detail filled in by the monotonous, invaluable, and untiring efforts of the pioneer squatters. Already these men and their subordinates were close on the footsteps of the explorers. Should the adventurer remain some months absent from civilization, he found on his return settlement far across from what had been the frontier line when he departed. Hundreds of lives have been laid down in this service, under as strong a sense of duty and under circumstances as heroic as any of the deaths in the roll of martial history, and the names of the victims unknown and their graves unhonoured. They have only been members of the great band ever forcing a way and smoothing a road for a commercial population to whom their deeds, their struggles, their hopes and their fates are often but a sealed book. But the feelings of a man who knows that he has founded homes for future thousands must be a greater recompense than any his fellow men could give him.